At last, a voice for the people who pay big government's bills, not the people who make big government's bills. You are listening to Speaking of Taxpayers here on Golden Music Memories of Yesteryear, Gimme Radio, sponsored by the 362,000-member National Taxpayers Union. I'm your co-host, Pete Sepp.
And this is Rachel Slobodian.
Welcome to this week's broadcast. A whole lot has been going on in Washington, D.C. over the past week, though you wouldn't know it. Not a whole lot of legislation passing, but a whole lot of discussion going on. The Senate Finance Committee continues to hash over its healthcare reform plan with over 500 amendments. Is the direction moving in favor of taxpayers or against taxpayers? Well, it certainly seems that the so-called public option that many citizens were concerned about, the government-provided, underpriced healthcare alternative that would eventually squeeze out the competition of private insurers, that provision appears to be gone from the Senate's legislation. But what remains to be seen is whether there will be these things called co-ops, highly regulated, federally overseen insurance pools that might very well function like a public option. That's a battle, along with various battles over possible cost-saving initiatives in Medicare. Goodness knows the Medicare system is highly inefficient, highly riddled with fraud, up to $100 billion worth a year. But instead, senators seem to be fixated on reducing benefits in the Medicare Advantage program, which is almost like a private option, an exact doppelganger of the public option, if you will. And we just don't know how that's going to shake out yet. Have you been hearing anything alarming, Rachel, from Capitol Hill?
Well, actually, I was listening just the other morning to a segment on, of all places, NPR, and I was surprised to hear them bashing the co-op option. But basically, they pointed out how few co-ops currently exist, and it's not enough of a test case to really ensure that co-ops will be that much of a better option than the system that's currently in place in our healthcare system.
Yes, and of course, while all of this is going on, while NTU is carefully tracking the amendments and speaking out wherever appropriate on behalf of taxpayers, this should not just be a negative game. We are also trying to promote proactive solutions to our healthcare problems, among them allowing people to buy their health insurance across state lines, much in the way that they purchase automobile insurance. No, people are not like cars, but then again, insurance is a service provided to cover certain acts. If you widen the number of choices people have in insurance, if you throw open the market to more competition, that means costs could very, very well come down. So that is one idea we want to see in any healthcare reform package. We also need much more attention paid to medical liability reform. This is a very important issue because doctors are considering leaving the field because of malpractice insurance premiums costing them so much. Many would-be doctors aren't even entering the field, and this is particularly true of specialties such as obstetrics and gynecology, where the premiums for malpractice are just gigantic, several $100,000 a year for some of these practices. Until we can have tort reform that will place limits on damages, that may have a loser pays rule for frivolous lawsuits, that's going to be a huge drag on the healthcare system remaining efficient and competitive. So we need medical malpractice reform too. There are other tax reforms that might be made in the system to help people afford more insurance, especially self-employed people. They can deduct health insurance premiums against income tax, but not against payroll tax, which is still a huge burden on the self-employed. There's also the issue of the cap-and-trade energy bill introduced by Barbara Boxer of California and John Kerry of Massachusetts very recently. And they are saying we are going to get this bill back on track. As you know, cap-and-trade is a system whereby the federal government would limit certain emissions that are thought to contribute to climate change capping them. That's the cap part of cap and trade. Then the federal government would require companies and industries that can't meet those emission targets to purchase credits from other industries. The federal government would get a cut out of the sale or auctioning of these emissions permits. That's the trading part of cap and trade. Now, some may ask, well, what if the companies can't afford these emissions permits? Very good question. Very bad answer. The companies will either have to pass along higher prices to consumers, they'll have to lay off workers, they'll have to delay expansion plans, they may even have to eat into shareholder returns. And that's no small matter anymore, considering that 50 million American households are invested in the stock market one way or another, through mutual funds or retirement plans or dividend reinvestment plans, and many of those investments are made in energy-producing or energy-consuming industries. So a very troubling development on Capitol Hill, and rather surprising in that cap and trade passed by a very thin margin in the House of Representatives, just 6 votes. It was thought that the Senate would be even more resistant to this legislation, and so that the Senate's version would be somewhat watered down compared to the House's. But the exact opposite is true, leaving many taxpayer advocates to wonder, what do Boxer and Kerry have up their sleeves if they're making a bill here that's actually setting more ambitious emission targets that will impose more costs on the economy? How can they possibly expect to get that through the Senate? I certainly smell the prospect of political horse trading here, Rachel.
I definitely agree, and it's just particularly disconcerting. But one can only hope that maybe there will be, when it goes into the committee in the Senate and they're discussing it, that, the Senate is supposed to be the more rational, the more careful to act of the two bodies. So I'm hopeful that there might be the watering down that we were looking for.
Yes, yes. And watering down, folks, would certainly not be the most preferable alternative, which is killing this bill in its entirety and focusing instead on proposals that are environmentally friendly and economically efficient. But at the very least, we've got to play this game of minimizing the impact on taxpayers. It's not a fun game. It's not a fair game. The other side certainly doesn't play by the rules. But this is the game that we're playing. This is the hand we've been dealt, and we've got to make the best of it. What kinds of alternative proposals, you say, Gimme Radio listeners, would be ideal? Oh, there are lots. For example, if we improve the nation's air traffic control system to operate by satellite rather than ground-based radars, we can have a salutary impact on the environment. Seems strange? Not when you consider the impact of our current inefficient system. Airlines have to participate in very complex routing that keep their aircraft very far apart. They sometimes have to take routes that aren't as direct as they could be. If we had better satellite navigation and control of air traffic, if we were to implement that system, which is in place all over Europe, airlines could save fuel and time in the air. And when they save fuel, that means fewer emissions in the air, fewer carbon dioxide emissions, which apparently do have some connection to climate change. How much is quite debatable, but apparently they do. And so if we are interested in helping the environment, things like that, helping air traffic control, helping reduce traffic congestion on the ground, instituting hydroelectric power building projects. Those kinds of things can be very helpful without hurting the economy the way cap and trade does. We'll have to wait and see just how this battle develops in the Senate, but your National Taxpayers Union has the eyes to do it 24/7, 365. We're watching you, politicians. We're there. Don't get sneaky. And this issue is a sleeper issue. Is Social Security ailing? That's a very important question to ask as we debate health care reform in the United States Congress, because so many of the nation's economic prognosticators and fiscal gurus are saying, look, The immediate cost problem, the immediate source of liabilities to taxpayers is the healthcare system, the federal government's healthcare programs, and chiefly Medicare, the federal government's program for retirees. Yet, there is bad news also about the nation's other big entitlement program, Social Security. It turns out that there are badly hemorrhaging fiscal conditions in this system. Is that not right, Rachel?
That is correct. In fact, there was just recently a CBO prediction that said that the Social Security would begin a cash deficit as early as 2010.
The Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, folks, is the official estimating arm of the United States Congress. When members of the House or Senate request an estimate of how much a piece of legislation will cost the federal budget, the CBO provides it. But CBO also does short-term and long-term economic projections. Now, get a load of this, folks. Last year, CBO's director, Peter Orszag, said that the first cash deficits in Social Security would not arrive until the year 2019. Now the cash deficits, according to the new CBO director, will arrive closer to 2010, a 9-year swing. Now, part of this, obviously, is due to the economic slowdown, the fact that you have fewer people employed, fewer people contributing Social Security payroll taxes, but there's also apparently a little more demand being exerted on the system. And overall, the numbers are very scary because even once we get out of this economic doldrums, and who knows exactly when, some wonder actually if we'll ever get out of them, but that question aside, whenever this so-called recessionary period resolves itself, Social Security's finances will still not be in fantastic shape. According to the latest CBO report, Social Security will begin running a cash deficit of $11 billion in the year 2010. If the economy improves, well, it'll run a $1 billion deficit in 2013, $2 billion the year before and the year after, but then they start going up again. By the year 2015, we're looking at $12 billion. By the year 2019, $88 billion with a B. What this basically means, folks, is that there will be no more cash surpluses ever to accrue to Social Security's so-called trust fund. Now, there are folks who say, well, but cash balances don't really show the entire fiscal condition of Social Security because the so-called assets in its so-called trust fund are earning interest. So when you include the interest Social Security is earning, combined with payroll tax revenues, the situation doesn't quite look as grim. Well, the problem is, where is this interest actually coming from? The federal government. In essence, this is intragovernmental money being transferred. The assets in the Social Security Trust Fund consist of federal IOUs because Congress decided that when there were real payroll tax surpluses, they wanted to borrow that money and use it on other projects. What was left in their place are Treasury securities, otherwise called intragovernmental debt. Well, the interest on that intragovernmental debt has to be paid every year right out of the U.S. Treasury. This is that old argument when we say we owe the money to ourselves. Well, yes, we do, but the accounting is, unfortunately, adding to the federal deficit. Every dollar of interest that the U.S. government pays to the so-called Social Security Trust Fund adds a dollar to the national debt. So it really doesn't matter if interest payments are helping to make the picture of Social Security's cash deficit a little better, because for all intents and purposes, it's still coming out of our pockets, Rachel.
It is. And I think this is all just so frustrating because I remember back in 2004 and 2005, when that was really one of the great things that President Bush was pushing. And it was, of course, things to privatize the Social Security system. And there's actually a statement from Harry Reid back in June 2005, and that's when one of President Bush's big pushes was. And it said that, we won't even have a problem with Social Security system for at least 50 years down the road. So that's even more atrocious than that what seems like a little mistake in comparison that Peter Orszag said.
Very interesting, too, how this whole trust fund language continues to circulate around Washington. When we think of a trust fund in the private sector, we think of a legal instrument, something that walls off money and becomes inviolable, something that protects assets. Well, in the U.S. government's language, of course, trust fund means virtually nothing at all. There's income, there's outgo, there are assets, but the assets are basically worthless. As we said before, they are nothing but debt placeholders that the federal government pays interest on anyway. It's coming out of one pocket, going into another, but it's all being added to the national debt. And it's all happening a lot sooner than anyone thought. So for those out there who are saying, well, we have to worry about Medicare, yeah, agreed, we definitely do. But now, thanks to irresponsible policies of the U.S. Congress over many, many years of borrowing money against surpluses in the so-called Social Security Trust Fund, and now, thanks to a poor economy that continues to be performing poorly in spite of the TARP bailout and the stimulus funds, thanks to all of those things, Social Security's problems are coming to roost much sooner than many people had projected, much sooner than most of official Washington had ever projected. So knowing that Social Security's troubles are going to follow Medicare's troubles within just a few years of each other now, we need to start worrying about the kinds of reforms that can save America's retirement system, at least part of it, for those who need Social Security benefits the most, while helping others to save more for retirement so that they won't have to rely as much on Social Security in the near term. So what do you think, Rachel? Do we need to start looking at perhaps tax policies that encourage people to save more for their own future?
Most definitely. I think that's certainly a way to go. And I think it just goes back to one of the, differences in opinion that people on different sides of the political spectrum have, but it's who can use and choose how money is spent best. Is it the individual or is it the government? And as relatively young in terms of the entire window of working years, I certainly would rather be putting money away through a private fund for my retirement benefits and things like that than paying into a system with the government, knowing that I will never see a single dime of the money that I'm putting in.
Yeah, pretty bizarre. We often hear from opponents of this type of Social Security reform, well, individuals are just too irresponsible to save on their own, to make investments that will pay off in the future. It's irresponsible to let people do that. Well, what is really irresponsible here? Letting people make their own choices for retirement, helping them do that through the tax system, or allowing Congress to continue to borrow hundreds of billions of dollars that it claimed existed in this trust fund and keep raising payroll taxes and keep this accounting ledger domain going in perpetuity. I would submit that is the irresponsible thing. Congress's behavior here is the irresponsible behavior. Individuals can do far, far better. Let's hope this report is a wake-up call to policymakers and perhaps a good kind of stimulus, one that will stimulate Americans to contact public officials and say, enough of this. We need to come up with a system that relies on our intelligence and our responsibility, because on both counts, Congress, Mr. President, Congresses past, presidents past, you've failed us.
Folks, for this week's Outrage of the Week, we have one that hits very close to home for me. you might not care much about what's going on in Arkansas in terms of distribution of stimulus money, but I do care a lot because that's still where my parents live. And even though I haven't lived there for about 6 years now, it still is what I consider to be home. So I don't know how many of you already know this, but within the distribution of the $787 billion stimulus package, $8.8 billion is given to governors, and they can use it how they see fit. It's called the Government Service Fund, and it's absolutely the discretion of the governor to determine where they'd like to use the money. Most states have chosen to use it in areas that probably need improvement, such as with the schools, maybe in balancing their budget. But the governor of Arkansas, Mike Beebe, who is a Democrat, and he replaced Mike Huckabee, who was term limited. You guys may have heard of Mike Huckabee. Well, he decided that a good use of the money would be to go to a project for President Clinton. Just to rewind a little bit, back in, I guess it was maybe 2000, well, it was shortly after Clinton left office, they marked a site in Little Rock for the Clinton Library. And the Clinton Library Foundation actually pays $1 per year to lease the land from the city of Little Rock. So we're getting a ton of money through that. There's a bridge, and it's called the Rock Island Railroad Bridge. And the Clinton Foundation stopped short of revamping the bridge because they found out it was going to cost $8 million. Thankfully, the U.S. Congress stopped short of a legislative earmark for this bridge. But now the governor of Arkansas has decided to contribute $2.5 million to revamp this bridge. Now, some of you might be thinking, oh, okay, bridge that has to do with transportation, that seems like a worthy use. But I'm going to say again that it's a railroad bridge, and that there's really not, in terms of where it's located in Little Rock, I'm not sure how many trains actually even go through that section, not to mention if there's even a track that would lead trains to go over that bridge. And there's really no fair way to justify doing this, but the governor's office tried, and they said, extremely hysterical to me, they said that it would help Arkansas's steel industry. Well, saying Arkansas has a steel industry is a stretch, but even if one would go on the premise that it does, it's all pretty much, most of the steel companies and things like that are in the northeast Arkansas and some of the southern portion, and Little Rock's in the center of the state. So it's a little difficult to justify that bridge.
Unbelievable. So a project that was not a gigantic priority really on anybody's list suddenly became one when free federal money was available. Well, the problem is that money is not free, neither to the state of Arkansas nor Arkansas taxpayers, because it's borrowed money. It means a pledge of tax increases in the future on somebody, either the current generation of taxpayers or a future one, including people in Arkansas. It's taking money out of one pocket, putting it in the other, but it doesn't matter which pocket it comes out of or goes into. It's all belonging to taxpayers, and the money is at risk of being wasted. Is that your summation of the whole issue there, Rachel?
Exactly. And I mean, not that I'm for increasing government spending in any means, but the reality of the matter is Arkansas public schools lag behind the rest of the nation and have since, the time of after the Civil War maybe. And so the point is that not only could we put that money toward education, but within Arkansas public schools, there's all this money in Little Rock, and then there's an unfair distribution for the rest of the state, so much so that we've had court cases, that the General Assembly's gotten involved, and still nothing's been done. So it's particularly frustrating that Governor Beebe wouldn't see it more appropriate to give some of that money to some of the schools or something in Arkansas that needs repair, which unfortunately is a ton of stuff.
And lest any of you think that this is an isolated incident, we continue to get reports here at the National Taxpayers Union of stimulus funds either being wasted outright, fraudulently issued, or issued to lower priority projects that have suddenly been bumped up the list, sometimes for political reasons. I was recently contacted by a reporter in Montana about some of the stimulus funds going to a university there. And among the uses of those funds, well, Shakespeare in the Park, a study of periodontal disease, sending an analyst to the Andes Mountains to look at volcanoes. Interesting studies, sure. Is somebody going to take some kind of benefit from this? Well, certainly the people doing the studying and the people doing the acting, but is this the kind of funding uses that will actually stimulate the economy? Hardly seems to be the case. And one more instance of government deciding where to put money instead of consumers and businesses, and government making the wrong choices. I'm not knocking periodontal disease research or volcano research or Shakespeare in the Park, but again, folks, what if the money were left in our pockets to begin with, in our wallets, to fund that research? Wouldn't the research be more accountable? Wouldn't it be more quickly and effectively performed? Wouldn't the actors in the Shakespeare Company perhaps have a greater motive to give good performances, maybe even lower their ticket prices so they could attract more people? Who knows? We certainly won't, because this money has been forcibly taken from taxpayers and redistributed elsewhere. And that is, if anything, biggest outrage of this outrage of the week. Well, we don't like to excite folks and leave them angry and not leave them with an outlet to release that anger. That's why we have the legislation of the week. And this is one that would take back one of the bigger outrages perpetrated upon taxpayers in the recent year. That is the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, the big bailout of the financial industry and the auto industry. Tell us a little bit about that, Rachel.
This bill was actually introduced by Congressman Joe Henserling. He is a member of Congress from Texas, and he actually, last Congress, he was the chairman for the RSC. So the RSC is the Republican Study Committee, and it really is a great group of tried and true conservative members in the House of Representatives. And basically what he hopes to do, his legislation, is to stop all TARP payments by December 31st of this year. And his idea behind it, I mean, it surprisingly makes a lot of sense, and it just is basic common sense. But the point is that TARP is for emergency, and it's not meant to be a permanent one. And so he actually introduced it back in June, giving TARP a 6-month termination period.
Now, the title of this act is?
The bill number is H.R. 2745, the TARP Repayment and Termination Act of 2009. And again, he introduced it in June in order to give the federal government and the distribution of the funds a long enough time before it concluded, or he called for it to end in December 31st of this year.
Okay, that's the TARP Repayment and Termination Act. That was one of the programs, TARP, that began our slide into a deficit spiral that we are still trying to extricate ourselves from, and may never do so, given the way Congress is spending money hand over fist. But let it start here. Let the spiral slow down here with the enactment of this bill. Again, that bill number is?
H.R. 2745.
H.R. 2745. Contact your member of Congress. Urge him or her to co-sponsor that bill. If you need more information, come to our website at NTU, our initials for National Taxpayers Union, NTU.org. We've got it all here, folks. Act in the taxpayer's interest. Act today. Well, that about does it for this edition of Speaking of Taxpayers. We'll be back next week with more news of interest affecting your wallet. Until then, remember, you have the power to fight the power if you speak truth to power. And we speak truth to power every week here on Speaking of Taxpayers. I'm your co-host, Pete Sepp.
And this is Rachel.